I am here with Early Morning Barking, and we had a conversation on Twitter because I posted a study which was looking at no-FAP, which is a community for people who are trying to give up masturbation and pornography. And the study found that identifying as a pornography addict was associated with higher narcissism. And so we wanted to talk a bit today about cluster B personality disorders and sex. And Rich has got his personal experience, and I've got my professional experience, and we've got a little bit of research that we can draw on. Do you want to
Hi there.
say, yeah,
So
say what you think?
it's such a big topic, isn't it? It's such a huge topic. I think there's so many areas we could go into, but this no-FAP stuff, the porn addiction stuff, the link to narcissism seems like an interesting way in. It feels a little, I don't know, that there was that, what was the thing you tweeted to me? It came up in that conversation that it hit a nerve with me, I think, because it was talking about the narcissistic struggle with intimacy and
Yeah, so you said you weren't sure why narcissism would be associated with identifying as a
with the,
pornography addict.
yeah,
And I think it's worth just spelling out as well that this study kind of calls into question the concept of pornography addiction
right.
and the concept of sex addiction in general. I think is not a particularly strong one, in my opinion. But so this study was finding that people who were engaging in no-FAP communities were also experiencing more distress around sex, more anxiety, more negativity about sex, and that it was also associated with narcissism. And you said, well, I don't get what engaging in no-FAP or identifying as a porn addict would have to do with narcissism.
Yeah.
The researchers in this study have said they're going to publish another paper. So I'll be really interested to see what they say. But from my clinical experience in working with people on the narcissistic spectrum, I think the challenges with intimacy, the challenges with being vulnerable with another person can sometimes mean that they seek escape and pleasure and
Mm-hmm.
I suppose an emotional escape. It's like an escape from difficult feelings through masturbation and porn because it's harder to connect with a partner.
That was the stuff. That was the thing that hit the nerve. Yeah. Because it's, again, speaking from experience, I think it sort of started off being about the porn, but it's very quickly not about the porn. And it becomes about that escape that you mentioned, that sort of zoning out. Because I remember I would characterize what it was like as more like I sat in front of the porn rather than watching and paying attention to it. It was an odd feeling. And I think for me, it certainly did come as a result of lack of other connection and that sort of thing. It was an escape from a great deal of pain. That's all well and good. That where I start to struggle with it is that in my experience, it became a compulsion. It became something that I couldn't stop. And so when people say, there's no such thing as as porn addiction, there's something going on. I don't know if it's an addiction to the porn itself or whatever, but there's something going on that leaves you in a no choice compulsion situation, which is what it becomes life destroying, relationship destroying, all the bad stuff when you can't stop doing it. I'm aware that addiction is a difficult term, but when you're doing something and you can't stop doing it and you're sat there doing it thinking, I don't want to do this. I want to stop now. I want to stop right now. And getting to the point of crying while you're still there doing it is
What about it was so distressing? Because it actually sounds like doing it was upsetting for you.
because you're aware of why you're doing it and the damage that it's doing to your life. And yet you can't stop doing it. I mean, because I got into that state because of a long-term lack of intimacy in the relationship that I was in. And so it was an escape from that, a zoning out from that. But you're aware while you're doing it that that's why you're there and that your continued activity in what you're doing is indicative of a massive breakdown in your relationship and a problem that at the time felt and turned out to be completely unfixable. And so it was sort of you're almost masking, but you're zoning out. You're avoiding the truth. You're avoiding reality. It's a head in the sand situation.
Mm.
And so, but you know why, and it's upsetting. It's distressing. And it's not the actual act itself of what you're doing, but yeah, it's that you know why. And so that in itself is the distress.
And
You wish you,
what was your why?
well, it was that lack of intimacy elsewhere. And for me, that the porn sort of became my sex life. That was how I functioned. It took the place of normal human intimacy, of which there was just none. So the porn took over. And at that point, it just became a case of sort of allowing myself to just fall deeper into it, sort of an acceptance of that in my life and all that sort of thing. And you just don't realize sort of the damage that it's doing to you and the harm that it's doing. Or you do and you don't stop it. I mean, that knowing damage and harm being done never stops anybody doing anything. We know smoking is bad for you. We didn't all stop immediately.
What was it that was bad for you?
Well, the amount of time that you end up doing it, for a start, we're talking hours on end. And no one really seems to believe me when I tell them this. I mean, hours on end. Like a day at work kind of time. Sort of an amount of time people looking at, didn't that hurt? You get through a lot of various lubricants and that sort of thing. It's just, so there's that. You've got the continued sort of, because it's coming from a lack of intimacy in the relationship and you've sort of fallen into it, it is kind of that you've become resigned to that. And that then sends a message back to your partner that I've given up on this. I do this now, which then causes bigger upset and stress. And, there's that sort of pseudo getting away with it thing where you think you're being subtle and getting away with it and nobody knows what's happening, but maybe she knows everything that you're doing. She just doesn't want to have a conversation with you about it and that sort of thing. And so it exists in this weird sort of, we're just not acknowledging it space in the relationship, which is not a good thing to have in any relationship about any subject. And so it just brings further breakdowns and problems there.
So I guess in that situation, the problem around the porn is that it becomes secretive, becomes a source of shame.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes something that is harmful to you in that it's taking up huge amounts of your time and it's possibly causing some physical pain as well.
Yeah.
And it's using porn in a way that replaces closeness in the relationship, which then damages the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then very often in these situations, the partner begins to see the porn as a problem.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting because for other couples, the research would suggest that couples who use porn have a higher level of satisfaction in their sex lives.
But is that using porn as a couple?
Or not always. Either using it as a couple or using it on your own, but not in secret and not with a sense of shame around it.
Right.
I mean, most people masturbate, even when they're in a relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it doesn't have to take the place of partner sex.
No, of course not. Yeah, I mean, that was ultimately the problem where I was. It took the place of it. And then, I mean, God, the worst thing was afterwards. But because you don't realize what it's doing to you and how it's retraining your brain and your reactions and your expectations and that sort of thing. And, even when I got to a point where that relation ended and I had new relationships and opportunities of actual human physical intimacy, which was something I always still wanted. I didn't want the porn. It was just there in place of something. And then when you get the actual opportunity, your body just doesn't respond to it in any way. Because you're not used to it. There is no such thing as sex for you anymore. And so there's no physical arousal. There's no excitement. Nothing works. And it brings about a severe amount of panic. That's when you sort of get to the doctor and you're having blood tests for testosterone levels and come on, I remember it used to work the last time I tried to use it, and now what's going on?
It's interesting, Rich, because there's a theory, and it is a theory that's not particularly driven by evidence, that somehow watching porn rewires your brain and stops you from having arousal in with a partner. But actually, what the research would suggest is that the problem is the anxiety. So it's like you said, when you're in a kind of sexual context and you've got panic because you're worried about, am I going to be able to get an erection? Am I going to be able to connect with my partner? The anxiety is so high, and that's what can create difficulties with arousal.
Can both things be true? Because I kind of feel like both things are true. I think that both things seem fairly reasonable because I feel
Yeah.
like I've experienced both.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Anxiety, fear, is this thing going to work? And then you worry, it's that self fulfilling prophecy. Definitely, that's a thing. Absolutely, that's a thing. But at the beginning, moving back towards a normal sex life and a normal sexuality, it was there was a complete lack of arousal from normal stimulus. There was nothing there because it was like you expect to be aroused by looking at things on a screen. And then when something comes from somewhere else, it just doesn't register at all. It's a very weird thing. And then you try the various medications there are for this problem, and they don't work either because, of course, they only help you when you're in a state of arousal, which you aren't getting to. So, and that brings about further anxiety and panic, and then you're just in it. And so it feels to me like both things really are. I'm prepared to be wrong and argued with on that, but
I am not an expert in sex therapy or psychosexual issues. So I'm going off research by people like David Lay and
mm,
Nicole Prouse, who maybe I'll reach out to and see if they'll join me and talk about this issue because I think it's a big one. But my understanding is that the research doesn't really support the idea that porn rewires your brain so
right.
you don't get aroused by normal stimulus, but that the mechanism that causes that is much more around shame and anxiety. But I get you as well that there may be a kind of habitual pattern of
Yeah.
what you get aroused by for.
That's what it felt like.
And I guess you
But
can also start to associate normal sexual contact with anxiety and shame.
yeah, that leads you to the no-FAP communities, really.
And then you're in the no-FAP.
That's it. So, okay, so whether there is such thing as porn addiction, whatever causes it, whatever, there are definitely communities that have this belief, and you can go and find them
Oh,
and
yeah.
join them. And they will support you in that belief and give you all the evidence that they have that supports that, and they will encourage you along. And that, for me, it was quickly obvious that it was a damaging thing to be both doing and part of.
Yeah, and that's what this research study found, where they were looking at the effects over time of people who were choosing to engage in no-FAP communities. And what they were finding was that people's relapses
Mm-hmm.
would be precipitated by depression, anxiety, suicidal urges, self-harm urges. That when they were in that sort of state of distress, that's when they wanted, just like what you were saying, that compulsion to
Yeah.
watch porn, because it's a good way to switch off. It's a good way to change the way you feel. And that also over time it was associated with more anxiety around sex and more negativity about sex,
Mm.
more shame.
I mean, so to be clear to everyone watching, the no-FAP communities encourage the sort of the complete opposite extreme of what you've been going through. Now you've been in excessive masturbation and porn use. Let's go to absolutely none of both things, and that will be fine. That won't be difficult at all. And if you screw up on either of these things, then you're a failure. And then there's sort of, that's a problem. You don't want to fail, and it is seen as failure and relapse and that sort of thing. And it's just the pressure that builds up around it is intense. And as you say, it's actually a coping mechanism for a lot of people, and they cut that off, and then that brings with it further upset and anxiety and all of those problems. But I think, I mean, first of all, it's no more of a natural state to be training yourself to than what you were doing before. As you say, everybody masturbates. That's a normal human behavior, even people in relationships. So training yourself to, or trying to train yourself to never do that is as unnatural as doing it for 8 hours a day. And so you're putting yourself through all this stress and worry to try and do something completely unnatural and painful for really no benefit at all whatsoever, and putting yourself at greater risk of harm.
What was the effect on you of doing that?
Right. So I, to a certain extent, taking a break, having a rest is a good idea, right? When you're wanting to return to normal behavior, you do have to stop doing what you were doing. And that part of it is okay. But that point comes really quickly where I think you should start readjusting to normal behavior. So preventing people from doing that is really harmful. That's where it gets difficult. And it's, I don't know, it's like changing any habit, because that's what you're in as well. You're in habitual porn use. And so breaking that habit can be as stressful as any habit: stopping smoking, cutting out sugar, whatever you do to calm down and relax. Getting rid of it is difficult. You need to find a replacement thing. I can imagine some people find other more negative things. If you want to zone out in a harmful way, the drug user community has got you covered there. We can do that. There's alcohol. There's many ways you can harmfully
Self-harm.
zone out. And so these are all bad things to fall into. And ultimately, you're not dealing with the problem that is causing your need to zone out in the first place. You just
I think that's also a really important point, that you can then turn to really harmful ways to zone out, like alcohol, drugs, self-harming behaviors. And what should the goal be? Because you're saying, should you just stop it entirely? But that doesn't work. And I kind of think there's an interesting parallel with binge eating, that people
right.
who binge eat, there's nothing wrong with eating, but what the problem is around the kind of shame and anxiety and the use of food to try to manage emotions. And if someone's binge eating, my dietitian friends will always say, what's the biggest predictor of a massive binge? Restriction. So if
Right.
someone's binge eating, they will tell them, I want you to eat 3 meals a day plus 2 snacks, no options. I don't want you to get hungry. I want you to basically be eating really, really well and not restricting, and no food is ever banned.
Okay.
So if you apply that approach to this, it would look quite different.
It really would. It's certainly not the no-FAP communities. And I think what you just suggested seems like a much healthier way of doing things. It can be a difficult thing to control. I suppose if you are currently also dealing with the underlying issues, then it becomes a different thing altogether. But gosh, yeah, it's a very distressing thing that people get into. And it really is just a coping mechanism.
Because you engaged with NoFap.
I tried to I started off with the opinion that that was the right thing to do. That if I can just get to a state where just never do that, just change that mindset, I don't do that very much, but that's the argument, right? It's not, I haven't done it for a while. It's not, I don't do this very much. It's the mindset is, I just don't do this. Okay. And when you're trying desperately to get out of this habit, then that seems like a clever thing. All right, I'm just going to stop. I can just never do this. It's like giving up smoking. You don't have one cigarette a day forever. You give up. And this seems sensible. The difference is it's not natural to smoke cigarettes. It's very natural to do what I was doing, just not as much. And so giving it up entirely, not really, that becomes its own thing. Uh,
Well, it's also not something that is healthy. It's healthy to give up smoking entirely.
mhm.
May not be realistic for everyone. You might want to wean off slowly, but ultimately, you could have a goal of giving up entirely, and that would probably be in your best interest if you're able to do it. It's never going to be in your best interest to give up all sexual pleasure or all food entirely.
No, exactly. It's a dangerous and upsetting thing to try and give up. I think, now I think about it, that I was quite lucky when I was trying to get out of this situation that I'd found a new relationship with someone who understood and was at least not upset and angry about it. They hadn't been through the worst of it. And so I got to recover within sort of a loving relationship, which was a great environment to do it. And I think a lot of the young guys that we see on no-FAP communities are trying to do it on their own with no, I hate to use the term goal, but with no goal in sight. For me, it was a question. I had specifics. It was, I don't just want to be able to have sexual intimacy. I would specifically like sexual intimacy with this human being who is here waiting for me to be able to do that with them. That was why I was getting into it. It wasn't just a case of, I'd like to regain sexual function so one day I can try and get a girlfriend, which is a much more vague, sort of lonely thing and way of going through it. And that obviously pushes people towards community and trying to find, people with a common goal. And it wouldn't surprise me if within that we then start to see lots of other sort of slightly misogynistically darker attitudes begin to appear and that sort of thing.
Well, you can get then the resentment towards women
I
who
was
don't want to have sex with you.
I was just going to say, I imagine there are areas where the no-FAP communities bump up against the incel communities,
That wouldn't surprise me.
which is by no means me saying they're both the same thing
No,
or
no.
linked, but you can see there being there's some crossover on that Venn diagram.
Mm,
Definitely.
mm. Yeah, well, and I guess how do you, because I think what you said really nicely was you had a partner who understood.
Yeah.
And if you approach a relationship where there's a huge amount of shame around sex, and you bring that to the relationship and add to it if the partner also has shame and discomfort around sex, that's not going to be a good combination.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I was lucky enough to find somebody who has absolutely no shame around all of that sort of thing. And so it was very encouraging to find someone that you can just talk openly to. But I'm aware that there are, I mean, right. So we're generalizing a lot, but it seems okay that generally we're talking about men with the problem and women who are trying to deal with men with the problem.
It's not
Or
necessarily that way round.
not necessarily that way. It just feels like it's probably more commonly that way around.
But it's,
Um,
I think, yeah, I think it probably is more common. It happens in gay relationships too.
oh, yeah, of course. But my point where I was going with it is that I think some people even have issues with the fact that their partner has seen porn or used, like, there are people for whom the existence of porn is upsetting. And, you know, to find out their partner watches it, uses it, whatever, in itself is quite distressing to them. And they also might, or have other shames and guilt feelings around sex and sexual activity that makes it just very difficult to talk about anything in that area, let alone a problem or something that is a big problem.
I think our sex education in schools is pretty appalling. And like, if you also bring in any kind of religious element, I mean, I know the sort of North American therapists talk about this all the time, but I think it's an issue
Yeah.
in British schools too, where you don't leave school with a sense that masturbation, sex, and pornography can be positive experiences. And there are questions around the ethics in the porn industry.
Yeah.
And, I don't want to get too into that, but the idea that there's something inherently wrong in watching sexual material.
I must admit, I struggle with the morality of it. and I don't know how to reconcile it with porn. I really don't. I recognize the harms of the modern porn industry and that kind of thing. But also at the same time, there's a great deal of human nature involved in this. Even if you were to sort of ban all professional pornography, I think if something is legal to do, it should be legal to film it. And I understand that there are people who would enjoy getting off on having it filmed and then having other people see that, and then that's porn. So I don't know, like, how do you?
See, I
I,
would professionalize the porn industry because,
right.
and then you protect the people in it with workers'
Hmm.
rights, and you make sure everyone's consenting, and you pay attention to health and safety, and you pay people fairly. And if that is how someone chooses to make a living, fair play to them.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in the porn industry. I mean, I appreciate there are kind of exploitative and unethical practices, but I'm much more worried about the exploitative and unethical practices than I am about porn in general. And I think if you try to
Yeah.
ban the porn industry, you're just going to open the
It,
door to
oh, God,
really
yeah.
unethical and exploitative practices.
It couldn't be done. It
Make it
just couldn't be
legal
done.
and make it safe and
Yeah.
protect the people involved, and don't make it a shameful thing that people feel they can't assert their rights as someone working in the porn industry, that they couldn't take their employer to court if they were being treated badly or they were
Yeah.
being put in high risk situations at work.
I certainly think we've reached a point where it needs to be included in sort of sex education. I mean, you say, I actually don't know what is involved in children's sex education in schools these days. My last experience of it was when I was in year 9 and I did it.
I'm also drawing on my own experience. I don't know what they teach teenagers in school.
But
But I think the other thing to say is that young people are exposed to porn.
yeah,
And let's make sure they know it's porn and not sex education.
that's
Do not get your sex
that. Yeah,
education from a porn movie.
that's it. I think they need education about porn to say, look, this isn't real. This is as real as Godzilla versus Kong.
Absolutely.
It looks real, but it's not. None of this is. You can't do this, and certainly don't do that, and other things like that. Yeah, they need that. I think. I think a lot of people. I think there are a lot of adults who could do with that education still. To be perfectly honest.
This is where I think getting rid of the shame around sex and being able to have, like what you had with your partner, the ability to have a really open, direct, shame free conversation is absolutely key in
Hell yeah.
having a healthy, enjoyable, pleasurable sexual experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I was very lucky to find that. And I think it can be very difficult for people. It was being difficult for me. I mean, I, I've moved past the point where I would say that it was a major factor in the breakup of my relationship when I was full flow with it, because I think that, as we said, it was the fact that that behavior was there was indicative of deeper problems. And those problems were the cause of the end of the relationship. It just played out with the porn. That was just noise, you know, the fire after the explosion. So there were already problems there. And it was just an escape, but it's a horrible one.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering as well, was anything else helpful to you? So clearly, this relationship where you could be just very straightforward and shame free.
I mean, well, there was that. And then you sort of put into place other more traditional habit changing techniques. The very simple stuff. If you usually do it when you sit here, don't sit there. Let's sit somewhere else. Rearrange furniture. Let's break a cycle of habit as much as possible. And it really is. There's nothing clever to it. There's nothing out there. Like, look, Google changing habits, and it works like it works for everything else. And that was more helpful than anything else. I didn't get any help from the whole no-FAP attitude, other than further stress and anxiety, other than feeling like, well, now you're failing at failing. You've already got this problem, and now you just can't even get rid of it. And it feels like such a simple problem that you feel even more pathetic and stupid for not being able to stop. Like it's looking at something. Can you not stop yourself looking at something? What the hell is that about? That's not like an addiction to an intravenous drug or something. We're talking about looking at something. How can that be harmful? How can that be something that you cannot stop?
It's just fueling immense self criticism.
Yeah, yeah, immense self criticism, and for me, going through that at the same time you're going through group therapy and healing from all sorts of shame and things in your life, adding that onto it is not a helpful thing. It's really not. And so the best thing I did was cut it all off and just try and finding that, as I say, that goal, that thing to aim for, which always helps. But then now saying it, it's kind of like, and again, forgive the comparison. If you a runner that's training, it's easier to train for an event than it is to just train. I'm training because I want to run this marathon, not I'm just running. There's a lot more. It's better to have that aim and that goal, and that helped immensely. Having a person there made it possible, really. But still, there's lots of shame and anxiety and other issues that I deal with regarding intimacy and all of that, despite what I've done to try and sort of get over it. And I don't know, it all comes from that relationship rather than from the porn use. It's become clear that that's what it is. But there was a time when I thought it was all the porn use.
Yeah. I'm curious as well because what I'm really aware of is that I work all angles of this. So I'll work with the partner who's engaging in porn use to the point it's problematic. And I'll also work with the partner whose partner is doing that.
Yeah.
And it can wreak such havoc for the other person that they start to see themselves as unattractive, inadequate, unloved. This it comes with a huge sense of betrayal. And I'm curious, as someone who's on the other side of that, what would you say to someone's partner?
It's not about them. It's one of those things that it's not about them. I get why they would feel all of that. I really do. I don't think it's an unreasonable conclusion to get to, but it's not about them. In the same way that things like BPD rage and narcissistic rage are rarely about the person that you're raging at. It's just how this thing is coming out. The porn use is the same thing. It's not. Maybe I've gone a bit too right because with me it kind of was. It can be about your partner, but mostly it's about depends what that underlying issue is. If that underlying issue is their partner, then okay, yeah, but it could be easily a million things. But they're not going to know what that is unless they've had a conversation. And unless the person who's going through it has dug deep enough to figure out what that is. The porn use is a symptom, and you've got to figure out what is causing it. There's something else. And I think the no-FAP communities in particular, the no porn communities, are trying to treat the symptom. But until until you treat the cause, it's not going away. It's just going to cause further pain and distress. It's no-FAP is paracetamol for someone with a broken leg. It's not going to stop the pain. It's not going to fix the bone. And it's
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
probably not even enough painkiller to take the pain off entirely. It's just something you can't figure
Yeah.
out what else to do. But
But I
yeah,
think you make a really important point about it's not personal and it's not about the person you're with.
no,
And neither is erectile dysfunction, which is the other kind of issue that sometimes goes along with this. Like, it is not about, I always say this to people who are explaining this tell your partner, sometimes my body does not cooperate. It's nothing to do with you.
yeah, okay. I mean, if there are women who need reminding of this, telling of this for the first, I don't know, right? Erectile dysfunction. If we were to make a list of things that can cause erectile dysfunction, we really don't have enough time or a piece of paper big enough or enough ink and enough pens. It's anything and everything. And it is rarely, if ever, you. That's
It's rarely, if ever, a lack of attraction to you
yeah.
either. Sometimes your body just does not cooperate. And that's often due to shame and anxiety. It can also be due to physical health problems.
Oh, if you've had
Mm,
half an hour, not enough sleep, if you had that cup
absolutely.
of coffee at the wrong time, if it's just been less than 3 hours since you, there's just everything. If it's too cold, if it's too warm, if I just was in a mood at that thing I saw on TV and I can't quite forget about it, it could be anything. And it's just, no one must ever feel offended by erectile dysfunction because it's never about the person that you're with. If we didn't like you that much, we wouldn't be there. I think.
Yeah. And what would you say to someone who was struggling with this issue for themselves? Thinking, I'm really concerned about my porn use or my masturbation habits.
I think first of all, you've got to try and right. I mean, as we've said, it's all coming from a deeper issue, and discovering what that deeper issue is and fixing it is really the only way that you can start to get a handle on everything else. So try and do that. That feels like I am oversimplifying a mammoth task there. Just try
You're
and
right. I think there's a couple of issues. One is sometimes it is around shame and stigma around sex.
oh, well,
And
this
that's all
is
it is. And
yeah.
that's coming from maybe religious and cultural ideas
Mm-hmm.
that's also borne out in this research that religiosity is another factor associated with being engaged in no-FAP and identifying as a porn addict. So that can be a factor, and that can be about figuring out your shame and becoming much more accepting of your sexual desires, and being able to talk about them openly. The other issue may be more about difficulties with intimacy with another person,
Mm-hmm.
shame around yourself as a person, sometimes also using sex as a means to get self-esteem. That's like putting a huge amount of pressure on your sex life if your self-esteem comes from that.
I wouldn't know anything about that. See,
Denial.
there's lots we can go into because I'm aware of it. I am alarmingly self-aware about all of this stuff, and it drives me a bit nuts. But yeah, there's all of those issues: the anxiety and the fears and the self-esteem, and God, so many issues surrounding all of that as well. It's a big factor. But I think you're right. Yeah, religion and just social background in general, bringing shame and that sort of thing regards to your sexuality. I can also see it becoming a bigger issue if somebody is struggling with being anything other than straight or whatever. There's a lot of potential shame and a lot of potential. Well, what if I do this? Then I have to go down this other path of coming out and all of that. And God, it's I can't imagine the stress and anxiety that brings with it. So yeah, God, it's a wonder we're not all doing it, to be perfectly honest.
Do you want to say more about the kind of, well, the use of sex as self-esteem use? Or no?
That's
You can
that's
say no.
I'm happy. It's a huge topic, that one. That is a huge topic. I would be interested to talk to other people with similar issues as me to find out how I compare and how motivations compare and that sort of thing. I've certainly come to feel that personally, I place a too high a level of importance on sex in life and the significance of it and all of those things regarding self-esteem and that sort of thing. But I kind of link it back to, in me, it feels very juvenile, to be honest. It feels like the same attitudes and values that I had when I was sort of 17, 18, and like I've never matured. which feels an odd thing to say. It feels like that. I've heard it said that people who suffer from narcissism get sort of stuck in a period in late adolescence when that trauma occurred. And it feels like this is heavily linked in with that for me. Uh,
Yeah, I think I can imagine that. I haven't thought of it in that way before, but I always think of narcissistic defenses are often quite adolescent.
yeah. And
And they can be sophisticated and they can be pretty strong and they can be very
yeah.
competent.
But yeah, it feels like
Yeah.
it's very adolescent, it's very teenage boy with are you doing it? Are you getting some? Are you she fit? All of the attitudes, all of the thinking, it is very adolescent. It's very immature.
Well, I guess that's sex as performance and a measure of your self-worth as opposed to sex for pleasure and enjoyment.
That's what it is. It's that teenage, status of it. Of am I doing more than my friendship group are doing? Have all of that sort of thing. I want to be the cool one with this and all that. Yeah, and that comes out of me from time to time. It's been spotted and observed by others, and I'm aware of it. And I sort of try to just at least openly be a lot more mature about things. But it's true to say that internally, I still struggle with getting a lot of self esteem from that sort of thing. On the other hand, I think that also plays into why I'm so willing to talk about stuff a lot. And this sort of leads into other topics regarding sort of sex and narcissism and that sort of thing.
Go on.
Oh, we could do a book. This is where we start getting into things like other cluster B issues that are sort of right. I mean, because you get into things like kink and alternative relationship structures and all of that sort of thing, and how that heavily ties into my MPD and BPD, massively so. Yeah, this is a big tangent. That is a big other topic. We might be better off
Maybe that's
doing
for
that
another.
separately.
Maybe that's for another one. I'd love to
Yeah,
hear you talk about that.
yeah, but that was a big thing. Discovering all that stuff, and then discovering the number of people with cluster B personality disorders who are in this community
In
and
which community?
in the kink community. That it is a massive coping mechanism, not just coping mechanism, but way of facing psychological issues for a lot of people in various ways. There's a lot of rooms I've been in where you could shout out, "Who here has a mental health problem?" and the room would put their hand up. And we go, "Yeah, this is why we're all here, isn't it? Okay, cool, great, yeah." And it's been quite an interesting discovery about the things people do to face things and deal with things, and how, in fact, doing that helped me in particular with MPD traits and that sort of thing. It becomes a safe place to allow the mask to slip, to just like, I'm going to indulge MPD at this point in a
Is
safe
it?
and
I'll tell
happy
you something
way.
really, you'll like this, you'll be interested in this. There's a very famous relationships therapist, Esther Perel,
Mm-hmm.
and she says that female sexuality is inherently narcissistic. That women, when they are enjoying sex, need to switch off and be completely focused on their own pleasure.
Okay.
Because so much of the time women are kind of going around looking after everyone else and being the caretaker, that one of the things they do through sex is that switching off and being completely self-focused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
that's
so she's like, that's narcissistic in the best sense of the word.
to a certain extent, I guess. Yeah. I
I'm not
don't
saying
know.
I agree or disagree. I just think it's
It
an interesting thought.
I think it makes sense. It just feels a bit harsh to call it narcissistic. That's
That's
all.
because you have negative connotations with the word narcissistic.
Yeah, I understand it is to a certain extent self-centered, but it doesn't feel.
It's not narcissism,
Yeah,
what you talk about as narcissism, I think.
yeah. It's just making sure. I don't know. It's very different. But no, it makes sense. I think that is a thing. People are looking for that relief from real life, to just do the opposite thing for a while. And as you say, in that case, women being used to generally taking care of others and seeing that other people's needs are met, taking time to get their own needs met, I can't argue with that. Seems fairly reasonable to me. I don't think that's narcissistic.
When you think about the kind of kink community, because there can be a tendency to pathologize that
Yeah.
and say, oh, there's something wrong, like there's some sort of dysfunction here. What do you think? Because you're also saying this was a place that was helpful to you.
Right. It's like kind of, you don't have to be meant to work here, but it helps kind of thing. Right. So it's not everybody has a problem, and not everybody's doing it to help with a problem or whatever, but there are a lot of people who are doing that. And so I don't think that any of those activities in and of themselves are in any way harmful or a sign of any bad thoughts or problems or anything like that.
Can I
To
just say
say,
I agree with that
yeah,
very, very strongly.
to say that it's what we're getting over is, look, and having been part of, so like the drug debate a while ago, the thing some people who are against something never want to acknowledge is maybe that thing is fun. And in the same way that people don't want to say the horrible thing, maybe drugs feel good. Maybe that's why that people take them, but we can't. Shh. And in the same way with the, like, maybe people enjoy that. Maybe that's just the thing. It doesn't have to be because they're scarred or going through trauma or whatever. You have to acknowledge maybe some of this stuff is actually fun, and that people enjoy it. So leave them alone to get on and enjoy it. That's fine.
Doesn't necessarily lead to anything bad either.
No,
At its best, I think the kink community can be a really good place, particularly
absolutely.
when it comes like the emphasis on consent
Gosh,
and
yeah.
the discussions around consent
Hmm.
that are so explicit and direct, I think are a really good thing for people to learn about if they've got sexual trauma.
I've been invited to online seminars about consent and various things. Consent is a huge, huge thing. I think in this particular area, we run into a lot of problems, that there is a sort of established kink community, but then we have outliers of people who are, for want of a better phrase, dangerous. And I think you get a lot of high profile stuff. We've had some of it in recent years in this country, of women being seriously harmed or killed by people saying, I want to do kinky stuff. And then what they're really saying is, I'd like to murder you. And, that's not good. Tinder is not the place to meet people for stuff like this. But in general, you meet nice, lovely people who talk about care and looking after people, and, as you say, a lot about consent and all of that. The biggest misconception a lot of people have with that community is that any of it is forced, or that anybody is coerced or doing something against their will, because that's never, the opposite of that is part of it.
At its best.
At its best. Of
At its
course, there
best.
are
There
absolutely
are
bad actors in any community of any type.
absolutely. Yeah,
Absolutely, there are. And, everybody needs to do the best they can to keep themselves safe. And I think there are sort of, some of the bad actors are very obvious. They come waving big red flags and that kind of thing. But others aren't. But it's the same as any community, really,
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. No. Well, it has been a really interesting discussion.
It really has. Thank you for having me.
Can have another one at some point.
Yeah.
If anyone has more questions, leave a comment. I'm sure Rich or I can respond. And is there anything else you would like to say?
Not on our subject. I mean, everybody go and look at my channel and stuff like that as usual.
Yep.
But
Do check out Early Morning Barking.
that's it. Apart from that, no, I look forward to doing it again, and we can get into some more stuff. There's
Cool.
plenty to cover.
Thank you.
But thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. Take care.
You too. Bye bye, everybody.